Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Thursday, October 9th, 2025. We're going to be doing another quick preview into the 2028 presidential election, as there's obviously a lot of things that can happen. And even though we are 3 years out, we're already almost one quarter of the way there from the 2024 election, which is insane to think about. So, we're just going to be doing another quick preview and looking at some potential fun scenarios that could potentially happen. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X, and check out our website, electiontimene.ws, or just electiontimenews.com also works. Linked in the description below for news feeds and our latest predictions. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, looking in at the video, we can see here the map is the exact same as it was in 2024, more or less the exact same electoral vote count as it's after the 2020 census. And so this is the generic map. This is just for a generic matchup, and so this is going to be for a generic Republican versus generic Democrat. Likeliness is vaguely based off of the chance that a candidate's going to win, and then this is a very gracious toss-up category with basically any races that are going to be somewhere less than a 2/3 chance of winning or so for each candidate. And even that's being a bit gracious. In areas like Virginia, the Democrat would almost certainly be favored to win and such. So this is being quite a bit more open than the election already actually is for 2028. So the general consensus is that it's going to be a bit favored towards the Democrats, not by much. If we do look at the 2028 odds for which party, it is very slightly favored for the Democrats, but 53 to 47, which is a little bit high considering back in April it was literally going back and forth basically every week. But the Democrats have basically held the lead since mid-April, and that's generally just due to the anti-incumbency status for the overall country as a whole, blaming a lot of the problems in the country based on the incumbent party, which is partially part of why Donald Trump was reelected in 2024. So obviously that's going to be a good bit of a factor at play in 2028. It's going to be just the fact that Donald Trump is in the White House. So that's going to be where a lot of the blame for current events and issues in the country is going to be right to the top, right to the head honcho, if you will. So what we're going to be looking at next is going to be just a few scenarios here. First, for the selection of the candidates. So I selected a few candidates here that are going to be relatively good or very, very poor for either party, essentially the absolute best you could get, but also trying to have a somewhat realistic ticket. So first off, worst Democrats versus the best Republicans. This is actually looking not all that unlikely. Kamala Harris obviously is not very favorable anymore. This was during her 2024 election cycle. She started off very low, but then as her name recognition got up, she was positive in the peak of the campaign. And then right around election day, her favorability dropped to about -3. Now she's really not doing that well, and right before the end of the election cycle or the administration cycle, it went from -6 to -12. And there haven't been any polls tracked since then. But she's obviously not necessarily very popular still, obviously. She had some favorability in the beginning of the term, though, for the first year or so. And then everyone turned on her about half a year into the first term. So that's going to be the number one thing there. But also, Gavin Newsom isn't very popular either. He's only at plus 13 in the state of California. Meanwhile, it voted plus 20 for Harris. So his approval rating is lower than the amount that a Democrat got in the popular vote on a relatively poor year. So obviously, that's not going to be a very strong ticket. Plus, Kamala Harris is now generally seen a bit as a loser in the Democratic Party because she lost a somewhat winnable election. It was going to be relatively difficult, obviously, but it was still a somewhat winnable election. Then we have J.D. Vance, who was almost certain to win the Republican nomination. I mean, just in and of itself, right there. Donald Trump is not eligible because of the 22nd Amendment. J.D. Vance, being the vice president, is obviously relatively favored. Over half of a chance essentially means if you flipped a coin, one and you picked heads, for example, then if it was heads, then JD Vance's would be the nominee. It's about what we're at so far. It has continued to go up for quite a while. There actually are a few events that actually are on this. That's new. But this was a relatively rough poll that came out just the other day against Shapiro. Oh, Marco Rubio endorsed J.D. Vance's 2028 nominee. I did not know that happened the other day, but that's going to be a main event there. But generally, very, very high, and then it slowly started to come down a bit, but then it went back up to its pre-era at this point, about 52% chance. So this is actually a relatively possible candidate ticket option. Something interesting to note is going to obviously be Donald Trump's approval rating, which is going to be, something to note there as well. What we're going to get off to is the Democrats. Jon Ossoff is a very strong overperformer. If we look in the Senate, we can see that he definitely overperformed by a lot. The war rating was minus 6.1, and compared to just the PVI, minus 3.7. So both those are very strong performances. For Ossoff, he's a very strong campaigner. And then Whitmer, almost the exact same can be said for her as well. She won in 2022 by 10.5 points. Tudor Dixon is a relatively weak candidate, but still, she was able to win in 2018 by 10. So she actually improved on her margin in a generally worse year for the Democratic Party. That does mean quite a bit about how well she does electorally. And that also is a relatively realistic ticket, as it would add some diversity to the Democratic ticket. Now, DeSantis isn't necessarily a terrible candidate in and of it himself. He's at plus 16, which isn't phenomenal, but it's right about in the middle of the pack, somewhere along with, the low teens or so is somewhere about where you usually end up with for the average or so. Nothing blowing anything away like Shapiro or Stein or Bashir or Kemp or Roden or Armstrong or or Gordon, or obviously Phil Scott, who's on basically his own level. But plus 16, relatively strong. It's just that he's not necessarily anything special. He's not necessarily a unifying voice. He didn't necessarily do too well in the 2024 primaries. Obviously, he definitely lost out to Donald Trump. And then Haley isn't necessarily a unifying voice either. She basically had the exact same fate there. She's not unliked either, but it's not necessarily that strong of a candidate. Scott and Graham, obviously, but I think at one point she had a campaign there. But she hasn't necessarily been too big of a campaigner. None of them necessarily have that huge experience. I believe that just basically it's just DeSantis having being governor and House member. But this is a relatively experience-packed ticket, as well as this one being pretty experienced, but honestly not well liked. These both have a lot of experience as well. Glenn Youngkin is the current governor of Virginia. Likely that will flip back blue, but we'll have to see, obviously. But he was able to win, even though it was a somewhat good environment. He still was a very strong candidate, and so with that, he's able to make a seat that voted for Biden by 10, then flipped by almost 12 points. Actually, flipped by 12. It was a 12-point shift from presidential to the gubernatorial that year. So that's going to be why all of those candidates were selected, relatively strong or very weak performances. So now we finally have all that out of the way. Let's get to the map. Let's start off with the Republican map. And what we're going to be starting off with is obviously going to be the safe states. All of these are going to be by 10 points or more. The first district is obviously going to be safe at this point. Trump won it by 13. I see no reason why it would get closer. Kansas as well and is going to be in that 10-point margin. These are basically going to be safe no matter who would end up running. You also have Utah. Alaska is definitely left trending, but even then it still would be probably pretty close. I mean, just PVI would be 11, but then you get the National Environment 3.2, it'd actually just be 8. So that would be somewhat interesting here. If we just quickly do this times 2 plus the National Environment, then you end up with all of this. So you actually end up with 7.8, but definitely relatively strong candidate there. Would definitely end up keeping it above 10, quite a bit above 10. It's definitely a bit left trending. You can see as well just directly in the Alaska thing, the weighted trend is minus 3.12. So it's about 3 points in respect to the nation every single election. So definitely it wouldn't be that huge of a shift to the left as a country as a whole if these two were the nominee, though. If these two were the nominee, then potentially it would actually shift a bit to the right. Other states that would go red definitely is going to be Florida. This is going to be a very strong state. Definitely would stay well above 10. Probably would go up to about 17 to 18 at this point. Only 8.6 for just that pure calculation, but that weighted trend 2.88. So obviously it's been continually moving to the right. It would definitely go very strongly for the Republicans. Same thing for Texas. It would not move back, even though there has been some collapse with approval rating, especially among Hispanic Americans in the approval rating. You can see Hispanic all the way down here at probably about minus 30 to minus 35, but still not going to be enough to shift it back if there's a strong ticket in that scenario as well. Next is going to be Arizona, which is going to be another state there, but that's going to be likely, so we'll get to that in a second. Harris and Newsom would still get quite a few electoral votes safe. Oregon's left trending, and that's the closest one. All of those would still end up actually being safe. Not by much, though. Washington would probably shift to the right by a bit. California would continue its slow rightward trend. That's actually must be able to move it down a little bit. But that's going to be a relatively close-inning one. Colorado continuing to trend to the left. New York would barely be over 10, most likely, potentially a little bit over 10, but right about at 10. Massachusetts, Maryland, not even close. Same thing for DC, obviously. Vermont, not even close. Maine's first, not really much of a contest either. 21 points. You have 25, 28, which is actually a lot closer than it was for Biden. 33 and a half, basically each. But still, Delaware, Connecticut, Rhode Island would probably still all go blue by over 10 points. They're already almost at their floor. But believe it or not, that's plus Hawaii, which went by 23 for Harris, but still it's down from 30 for Biden and 32 for Clinton. It's continuing to trend to the right at a relatively concerning rate for the Democrats, 3.12. So that's going to be actually it for the safe states. For the Democrats, they're actually down. That's definitely going to be a different story for the strong ones for the Democrats. Next, we're going to be going on to Arizona is going to be a likely state for the campaign here. A safe one actually miss is going to be Maine 2nd District. Relatively strong rural support. Definitely going to be boosting numbers there. Nevada is going to be likely. That's actually going to be continuing a trend that's been going for a while. It's already a 5-point shift. We just look at the margin. It already shifted 5.5 points. There wouldn't be much to shift another 1 point. It actually shifted a little bit to the right, and that's with Biden doing 2.4 points better in the national popular vote. So shift the whole thing by 2.4, and that's what you end up with the national trending. So That's the concern as far as Nevada goes. It would probably end up being likely on a map like this, especially with continuing trending support for the Hispanic population towards the Republicans. Iowa would definitely be safe. Ohio would continue to be safe, 11.2%. That would continue there, which would basically end up adding up to a complete firewall again of 219. Georgia. This one is actually a bit of a tough spot for the Republicans, especially that -3 with this expected 3.2% environment, but that's just very, very skeptical. I was mostly just doing test cases at this point, and this page still has to definitely be built up a lot, like the senatorial one. It hasn't been as big of a focus since it's still 3 years away. But Georgia is definitely going to be, honestly, the best pickup opportunity for Democrats going into 2028, believe it or not, just because of the continuing demographic trends. Then it's probably going to be Michigan, and then maybe North Carolina. We'll have to see how things continue going. Then probably Wisconsin, then Pennsylvania. So it's definitely all over the place. But it's gonna be an interesting interesting story to watch. But still, if it was a strong enough ticket going against someone weak like this Harris Newsom ticket would most likely be, then you could probably end up seeing Georgia stay red, not by that much. It might even trend to the left a little bit, going from maybe 2.2 down to like 1.8 or so. But still, it actually probably would definitely trend to the left if the national environment shifted one to the right. If you look at this trend for Georgia, weighted it's -3.3. So in order to keep it, right now it would go 1.1 for the Democrats. So the national environment would have to shift by about 1.1 to the right in order for Vance and Youngkin to win it. But if they're strong enough candidates, then they'd be able to hold it for a little bit less than that, obviously. So just about a 1 point shift to the right nationally would be enough to probably keep it in their column. Same thing for North Carolina. Believe it or not, it is still shifting to the left. If you look at North Carolina, -2 for weighted, that's continuing to go to their column. That would, in fact, stay red by right about a Joe Biden margin if it shifted by that much, 1.3%. Right about on par with Georgia here as well. That's going to be the main competitive states there. And now Vance and Youngkin are at 268. Harris and Newsom need to win every single other state that is left in order to win the election. And spoiler, they will not. So New Mexico, Harris won it by 6. This would definitely continue to contract a lot more. New Mexico weighted is actually to the left by 0.41, but that's actually just because mostly almost entirely because it went a little bit to the left from 2020 to 2024. Almost all of that is from that trend. If you look at the unweighted, which says how far it was basically just from 2008 all the way to 2024, and just divide it by how many cycles, it's actually trending a little bit to the right, but basically stagnant. But 0.41 for weighted, so that would be a little bit to the left. But if it ends up trending enough to the right, it would probably be just under 5. It'd be a bit within their sights. It'd be interesting to see how if they would actually campaign in North Carolina or New Mexico or not. But that would be a very interesting state to see there. They are going to pull off a win in Illinois, but it's going to be under 10 for the first time in decades, going all the way back to the Republican win in 1988. And so that would definitely be pretty rough for the Democrats. I mean, this is already the worst margin that they've seen going back since basically since 2004. Since 2004, it's 0.6% better than 2004, which is also the story of basically how poor the margin was in New Jersey by 6. This would end up being probably under 5 in this scenario, continuing to trend to the right. It was a really rough blow for the Democrats here. Weighted trend is 1.83 to the right. It was the second hardest rate trending state in the entire country from 2020 to 2024. And so that would definitely end up signaling a lot. And so if the country moved a point to the right, it would probably end up getting close to about 3 points or so. I don't think it would truly be competitive. There would be a few campaign stops here, but just there's so much turnout still in these northern parts of the state. Maybe Bergen would flip, for example, but I don't think there's much left for the Republicans to get as of right now in New Jersey, unless there's seismic shifts. Virginia would basically have the exact same story, be the closest that it's been since 2012, probably about 4 points. Again, worsening margin even from 2024. It is still a left trending state, 2.07 to the left, so that would actually be a bit of a stopping of that trend right there in its tracks. It would still be a win for Harris and Newsom, though, but not by much at all. It would be very, very close, especially with Youngkin there. I think that definitely could actually end up getting it to buck that trend of continuing to trend to the left. It would basically be held stagnant. It would actually obviously vote a bit to the right of where it did in 2024. New Hampshire definitely would actually go very well for this sort of potentially more general conservative, a bit toned down MAGA populist rhetoric. New Hampshire has definitely trended to the left. If you actually see 1.2 for weighted, and that's because just based off of from 2016 to 2024, it did shift 2.5 points to the left, even though Harris did 3 points worse in the popular vote. So that's literally 5.5 points to the left in those 3 cycles. So I'm not necessarily sure that the Vance Youngkin ticket could win it. It'd probably be relatively close to a Clinton margin again by a third of a point. It would be way closer than Harris Newsom would ever want it to be, but I'm not necessarily sure that it would go for the Republicans this time. Same sort of thing with Maine. It'd be somewhat close to that, probably just over 3 points though, but it would still be pretty close at that point in time for the almost the exact same reason. Pennsylvania would almost certainly break 2 points for the Republicans, and that would actually be the first time that that's happened, going all the way back since 1988. Potentially would probably break Bush's margin. So that would be the first time that it had gone over 2.5 points since 1984 for the Republicans. So that would be a historic margin there. It's been trending just a little bit to the left, but that's honestly just mostly because it's weighted from 2020 to 2024, went from 3.3 points to the right to a quarter of a point to the right of the nation. So that's definitely going to help that trend. If it was other than that, if you can see in general, it definitely shifted to the right. So that's going to be the number one thing to notice there is going to be that actually it breaks 2 points. It's the most right leaning of the 3 states this cycle, even though it had been right in the middle otherwise for the other 2 cycles. Michigan would probably be right about 1.75 points to potentially breaking 2, but it's not necessarily the exact same. 0.8 for weighted is shifting to the right, just because of how much Trump shifted it to the right from 2020. It actually was a bit of a shift to the right between those 2 years. It went from 1.7 to the right of the nation actually to 0.06 to the left. So basically that is the bellwether state, but it did shift quite a bit to the right from that point. And in Wisconsin, that would probably end up actually breaking 1 point for the Republicans. First time that it actually broken 1 point in margin since 2012. For the past 3 cycles, it has been under a point each and every time. 3/4 of a point, 2/3 of a point, and then 0.85%. So all of those were very slim margins. The turnout gain for both parties is phenomenal in Wisconsin continually. Minnesota would probably go by a little bit less than 3 points or so, 2.5 points, 1.5 to the left, and that's generally because of the trend again from 2016 to 2020. It actually voted to the right of the nation in 2016, only voting for Clinton by 1.5%, but it voted quite a bit to the left of the nation, about 5 points in 2024. So it's been slowly trending to the left. It has the longest voting streak for going Democratic in the entire country. The last time it went red was 1972 in Nixon's 49 state landslide, and it has gone blue every single time since then, being the only state to do so in 1984. And then finally, we have Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, which is definitely left trending by quite a bit. 4.35. It's actually the strongest, because Utah has the exception of McMullen in there as well. 4.35, and also Romney messes it up. The most left trending area in the entire country. Harris won it by almost 5. Biden flipped it by 6.6. Trump won it by 2.2. Obama originally won it in 2008 by 1.3, and that was the first time that any state had split its delegation via specific voting rules going back to basically the 1800s. So that was definitely something interesting to note, I guess, in 2008, some fun factoid. But then, of course, it happened again in 2016 for Maine. That was the first time that it split its votes. But Harris and Newsom would likely win it, probably be about 3 points or so if it shifted to the right, which means that we would end up with a 312-226 map, but it would be considerably worse for the Democrats, especially up in the Rust Belt. Worsening margins, could potentially end up seeing a lean Michigan. Definitely worse down in the Southwest. Better in the Southeast, numbers would be getting better, but still would not be looking good by any means for the Democrats in basically anywhere across the entire country. So now we're going over to the Democratic map. There's actually quite a bit more to gain because of how strong of a year 2024 was for the Republicans. I don't think there's much else to gain, and considering how Trump's approval rating started up so high and then has actually completely collapsed, shows that actually there's just a lot to lose as far as the Republicans go. And also just looking at this, for example, 2028 Pennsylvania, Shapiro being up by 10 against Vance in a completely hypothetical. He actually broke 50%. Obviously, Shapiro isn't on this ticket, but still that does mean a lot about how well Democrats could do electorally. So I feel like there's definitely more room to gain for the Democrats. So to start things off, we're going to obviously have the safe states here. We have Washington, Oregon, and California. New Mexico would be safe. It was safe in 2020. It's continuing to trend to the left, so it would be on that safe map this time. Colorado would obviously be safe. Harris won it by 11. It's going to continue to trend to the left, and also the nation would probably shift to the left by about 4 points or so in a good year. Minnesota would not be safe. I don't know why I put it there for a second, but it would be relatively close. Biden did relatively well. He won it by 7. It would probably be close to about 8 points. I don't know why I put it in safe, though. Illinois absolutely would be safe. It'd be closer to about 15 points. It has been trending to the right by about a point every cycle, but it would still be by over 10 percentage points in this matchup. Obviously, the safe Northeast would continue to be a deep blue, as well as New York, as it would end up, even though it was continuing to trend to the right, it may actually trend a little bit to the left in respect to the nation, just because of the potential pushback that's going to be coming from the central New York City region. But that's going to be the main story there. And so New Jersey would probably go back in this column if we end up with an increased turnout game in the outer New York City region. Obviously, that's almost entirely where Kamala Harris lost this election. I mean, let's look just in Essex County, 224,000 votes versus 266,000 votes, and Trump got 75,000 and then got 83,000. So most of it was just that Harris voters didn't show up. So that's going to be the number one thing in New Jersey. That would probably end up going closer to about 12 points, not even necessarily that close to Biden's margin, but still a considerable gain from where it was in 2024. Then we'd also have Virginia, which Biden did win by over 10 points in 2020. This would probably end up going by about 12. That would be continuing to be a strong margin there as well, especially with increased growth in the Northern Virginia region right around Washington, D.C. We're going to especially see how well things can end up going for the Democrats in the upcoming governorship election, obviously. But as of right now, we'll just have to essentially go off of that. And then we have Hawaii is going to be the last one other than the Maine's 1st District, very safe states. DeSantis and Haley are going to still hold on to quite a few safe districts and regions just because of how generally polarized this country is at this point. There's just a few areas that they're just going to continue to win by 10 points or more, even though they're very poor candidates. So just to get together here is going to be the main base of 154. Now, Texas actually probably be a bit below. Because DeSantis is on the ticket and Florida is so right trending, that would definitely end up being still a safe state. He did win by a very impressive margin in 2022. He is relatively well liked there as well. So all of that put together, he is going to win that state by his home state by more than 10%. So that's going to start off with the safe states. They only have 144, which is definitely quite a bit less than they did prior. Texas is going to go back down below a safe margin again with the trends back from the Hispanic voters, as well as potential urban strengths, especially compared to how well Biden did with some of these counties. Some of them trended quite a bit to the right, like Collin County from 4.4 to 11.1. That's a 7-point shift. Tarrant County, Biden managed to narrowly flip it, and then Trump won it by 5. Williamson County, which is a suburban county, actually trended to the left, even in respect to the state. So that is interesting to note as well. Bexar County actually was harder to the right. For this is what the old Rio Grande looked like. For Clinton, she won all of these with safe margins, especially very, very strong one, Starr County. 60 for Clinton, 5 for Biden, Trump 16. But Bexar County went by under 10. Harris won Harris County by only 5.5, even though even Clinton won it by 12.3, Biden won it by 13. So slowly right trending, which is interesting. It might have actually hit a final bump, and now it's actually gone back down. But that's this is, I believe, the second most populous county in the entire country. So that's definitely going to potentially harm Democrats if they're going to continue to not be able to get that turnout. But anyway, Texas itself is complicated. To start things off with the likely states, and actually Missouri being 18, Kansas was actually closer than Missouri, and Kansas probably wouldn't be that close. Even if it did, it might be right around 10, believe it or not, just because of the national shift and the continued trend. Kansas shifting by 3.2 per cycle. Then you end up with, obviously, 3.2 to the left every cycle. Then you would have plus 13, 3 points to the left. Then you'd end up with 10. So it'd be right around 10. It might actually end up being single digits in this hypothetical scenario, depending on how well they end up doing with rural voters, obviously. But that's just something interesting to point out. Okay, next is going to be the likely states. Start off with Minnesota up in the north. That would be a relatively strong showing there, obviously. Probably about 8 points better than Biden's margin, continuing to trend to the left. Maine would definitely be included in that as well. Harris won it by 7. I mean, well, Biden won it by 9, so you could potentially argue that it could potentially hit 10 for the first time since Obama won it by 15 in 2012. So that would be potentially up to about 10. Maine's second, unless you end up getting someone strong with rural voters like Andy Beshear or someone along those lines, probably going to end up still going red, probably by a bit less, though, the least smallest margin that it's had. 7.5 in 2020. That would probably end up shrinking a good bit, though. New Hampshire would definitely go by close to a Biden margin of 7.5, potentially up to about 10 points. It seems to be somewhat libertarian, especially in the issues of the state politics, but it tends to go Democratic on the national level at this point. Also going to be unlikely is going to be Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, if not safe at this point, 6.6. If you end up continuing to a trend that, it would be by over 10 at this point. Harris won it by 4 3/4 points, so that's going to be relatively strong there. 3.4, if you just take that in and of itself, that would be, I mean, just look right here with the national environment, and you end up with, I don't have it separated out. That's actually dumb. Oh, there we are. Then you end up with minus 10. So that would actually be a 10-point margin. But potentially just under that. Depends on how well they do with suburban voters. If we go on the upside of that, then potentially you could end up with strong suburban support would actually end up bringing that down below 10 by the slightest amount, probably like 9.8 or something. Very, very close. But you would still end up with the Nebraska's 1st district with suburban vote being down. It would be under 10. And this is without any redistricting in Nebraska. That's all hypothetical at this point in time still. Also going into likely would be the state of Iowa. At this point, rural voters are essentially out of the question unless you end up getting someone like Andy Beshear. You could potentially end up getting this down below 5. But as of right now, Iowa is continuing to trend to the right. Even Scott County ended up flipping, which Clinton won by 1.5. Biden won by 3.5. You end up having these outer urban counties. This Interestingly, Dallas is trending to the left, but that's because it's a somewhat suburban county. But Story and Polk are the ones that the Democrats have to get every single vote out of, and they've been continuing to trend the wrong way. Biden won it by 15, and then Harris only won it by 11. Lynn County, a lot of votes. Johnson County, Black Hawk County going the complete wrong direction for Democrats there. That's a lot of votes that Democrats need to be able to get out because that's, 60,000 votes there. Meanwhile, you get 60,000 votes out of Lynn County, but still, most of it's out of Polk. Still gonna have to get a lot of numbers out of there, but still, that's not going to be the right direction for Democrats by any means. But then you go to likely for the Democrats, you actually don't have any more at this point. Lean for the Republicans, just alternating. This would actually be Texas. Narrowly though, it'd probably be about 4.5, just under 5. Continuing to go, basically resuming from where it was in 2020. Now you may say that yes, it did shift 8 points to the right, but it could shift back hypothetically. And after one more election cycle, typically it would tend to have one last hurrah for the potential Hispanics, especially in the Rio Grande Valley and in Harris County, Travis, Dallas. The suburbs would also shift very hard to the left. It could potentially end up getting somewhat close. At this point, 8.6 would be the number to look at, so it might end up being close to about 5 or so. But yeah, so probably about close to about 5 or 6, but you could potentially end up seeing really low depending on how extremely well they do in the suburbs. So the counties to look at would be Williamson, Tarrant, Collin. If Collin flips, then that would show very strong support, and potentially it could get down to about 3 points. But that would be absolutely interesting race to see this ticket. Also going on with lean would be Arizona at this point, actually. With this number, it actually says it'd be 0.2 for the Republicans, but just considering how hard it trended to the right and just with the Latino vote in general, I think that just based on that 6-point shift to the right, I'm not sure they would end up going that close. It potentially could end up being close to about tilt, probably be somewhere in there, but it actually might. It's probably going to be relatively competitive. Not exactly sure about if the Democrats would be able to pull it off in Arizona, but that would be something interesting to watch. Lean would be Ohio. That would probably end up getting much closer, even though Trump won it by 11.2. He's been doing relatively poorly there. Also, something with Texas is that actually it is now again at a point where 2024 voters are actually disapprove of Trump. Ohio's pretty close, 1.9. But in general, 8.9% disapproval rating, so that's going to hurt a bit. But that actually would probably be more of an argument for Texas going under 5 again. But Ohio being under 5 would be pretty concerning, considering that it went 8.1 for Trump and then 8. It barely moved at all because there was a lot of shifts in. There are some shifts all across the rest of the state that actually continued to trend towards Trump, even though the suburbs moved towards Biden almost entirely, and actually Cuyahoga County moved towards Trump. But the rurals continued to move towards Trump, and they almost got entirely saturated, even if they weren't 100% so. In 2016, Trump won, some counties by 30 or so, when in 2020, he won them by 40 to 50. And in 2024, he won them by almost 60. So that's going to be where he got all his numbers from. But if you end up reeling some of that back, then you could potentially end up getting a slightly slimmer margin. Not necessarily going to be able to win back enough support or be able to potentially flip Lorain, Mahoning, those counties that used to vote blue at this point, but not necessarily going to be able to win the state back at this point. It's too far gone. Lean for the Democrats would be Michigan. This would actually be probably one of the last times the Democrats would be able to win it, considering its trend, minus 2.6, so wouldn't even buy by that much. In 2020, Biden won it by 2.8, so actually that would be closer than in 2020, which does definitely say a lot about how it's been trending. But also on this list at that point would actually be Georgia -3 with this number. It'd probably be definitely closer than that. But this would be a pretty huge win considering that it would be about 5-point shift to the left. But that's about what we'd be looking at nationwide too. 5-point shift to the left. North Carolina would definitely actually be won with this ticket, which means that the Democrats would win the presidency, 273, and still going at this point. But that would definitely be pretty big, obviously, because Biden got pretty close, 1.3%, but it hasn't actually gone blue since 2008. Obama won it by a third of a percentage point, but that would be relatively close, maybe to about a point or so. North Carolina on this says it would go by 1.4. It's a bit of an overestimation for the Democrats, probably. That's actually bluer than it was red in 2020, which would be very interesting if that actually went up going through. But these are mostly going to be from demographic shifts, continuing developing urban areas. If you look at the shifts, you can see there are definitely a few, but Wake County only by 1, Mecklenburg by 2.4. But you see over here, you actually have a bit more growing out of Buncombe County, which is, I believe, a small city in of itself. But then also, if you look over here in the inner city region, you actually end up with a bit of losses. But in the suburbs, Harris kept growing and gaining support. So that's why it's actually still trending to the left. And you could also see that in North Carolina. Johnson County, Chatham County, Gaston, Lincoln, Caribou, Stanley, Davidson, Alamance, these regions in the Research Triangle over here and right outside Raleigh, as well as outside Atlanta, are really going to be where that election is going to be won. Pennsylvania would probably be tilt blue. It's actually been relatively red. It actually says 2.4. I think it'd be just under 2, maybe about 1.5, a bit more than Biden won it by, but maybe a bit less than Trump won it by this time around. 19 electoral votes on the line there. It used to be a very blue state. It even went blue narrowly in 2000 by 4.2, 2.5 for Kerry when he lost the popular vote by 3. So that definitely says a lot about the state of 2. Lost popular vote by 2.4%. So quite a bit to the left of the nation, but now it actually voted a little bit to the right of the nation. That definitely says a lot about how it's been trending, but still Democrats could probably end up pulling off a win with the state of Pennsylvania. Michigan, now that I think about it, with Whitmer, might be able to get that number up a little bit more. Michigan would probably be a bit more than Biden's number in 2020, maybe about 3 points. Wisconsin would probably be a tilt margin as well. It doesn't really move that much. It would probably be about 1.5 points at best. With this, you end up with +3, D +3, which is pretty crazy, but probably be a bit closer than that. And then Nevada really depends on how things end up going. It's a very right trending state. Even with this, it actually says -1, which would be very, very close. It'd basically be one last time to squeeze out a win in Nevada. But it'd be very, very close. Depend on the Hispanic vote, how strongly things go. If the Cuban vote in Florida with DeSantis actually still stays red, then you could potentially end up having a Hispanic vote scenario where the Republicans end up winning Nevada. So that would be a 302 victory, which means that you end up with a stronger victory for the best Republican scenario than the best Democrat scenario. So, but you could potentially end up arguing that you could potentially end up squeezing out a win if you end up getting enough out of. It's going to all come down again, as it always does, to Clark County, as 3 and 4 Nevadans live in Clark County. And so that's going to be the final result. There's going to be 308 to 230. And in this one, it's going to be 312 to 226. Again, you could suggest that maybe Vance and Youngkin could squeeze out New Hampshire in an absolute best case scenario. That'd be 316 to 222, with only 4 electoral votes flipping, which is actually ridiculously small amount, and actually one of the smallest amounts of votes that have actually flipped since 2004. That was quite a small amount, 27, 100, 74, 77. So that'd be the smallest amount of electoral votes that have shifted going back, including 2004. I don't think there's actually any election in recent history that's actually had that few. 1960 actually did have quite a few flips. It doesn't show them because it's not on the same page. Even 1956 had more. I think that would actually be the fewest electoral votes flipping in history. So that would be pretty interesting. Yeah, that's even 16. So that would be definitely unlikely as far as just statistics go, or maybe that just shows how polarized we are as a country at this point in time. It's almost uncertain to tell, and considering how variable things used to be based on large national trends, it's actually somewhat disappointing to see. But still, this is going to be 308, 230, and 222 to 316 for those final maps. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. Make sure to please leave suggestions in the comments. I'm interested to hear what you guys want to see more of. And thank you all again, and have a fantastic rest of your day.